Welcome to the walkthrough for the frequently made mistakes I observed when reviewing your assignment two-way solutions. First and foremost, do not remove the to-do statements. That makes my reviewing job a lot harder. Second, make sure you thoroughly document your code. Don't rely on the comments that I have that provide the specifications for what the method should do, but you should be documenting all your code. Let's talk about some of the problems I saw in Acquire, Palantir, and Gaze. First, make sure you structure your code so you never need to check if Palantir not equal null. In particular, make sure that you try to acquire the Palantir outside the context of the try finally block, and then check to see if you got back a null, and only go in here if you did not get a null. A couple other problems with Acquire, Palantir, and Gaze are shown here. First, you don't need to do the assignment of the Palantir to null. Just go ahead and initialize it to Acquire Palantir. Also, make sure to comment your code. And finally, make sure to structure your code so that if a Gaze call throws an exception, release Palantir will automatically be called. Let's now turn our attention to problems that I saw in Executive Service Manager. First, make sure that you initialize the mFutures field in the begin being thread pool method, not up here in the definition part of the class. Also, you can omit this particular piece of syntax. The compiler can deduce that. Also, make sure that you don't just define a list of future, but you have to define a list of future of the appropriate type. Otherwise, you'll end up having problems with type checking. Down here, this call to create the executive service should not be in run simulation. Instead, it should be moved into begin being thread pool. Speaking of begin being thread pool, let's take a look at some of the problems that occurred there. First of all, if you're going to use a stream, then I recommend you replace the use of for each with collect, and then you won't have to initialize your field with an explicit call to array list. So that's a much better way to do things. Down here, make sure that you call the create executive service factory method rather than calling executors.newFixThreadPool directly. That's really not the point. That's why we have a factory method to encapsulate that properly. Also down here, surprising number of people forgot to initialize their m being callables or whatever you call that field to some sensible value before trying to add to it. So you should be getting a null pointer exception when you run the unit tests. So I'm very surprised that people had code like this because it should be blowing up when you run the tests. So make sure you run the tests and fix those problems before submitting your solutions. Another problem I saw a number of people do is they would have some local variable here, like this one, where instead this should actually be initializing the field, not a local variable. Likewise, you don't have to have both the call to the callables initialized with an array list and a use of collect. That's not necessary. Also, make sure you use a method reference here rather than using a lambda expression. It's much more concise, and your compiler should actually flag that for you and do the transformation automatically. Let's take a look down here for await completion of futures. Most people did a pretty good job of that. One problem I saw was, again, not giving the proper type for the future. You need to make sure you give the proper type for this so it's typed correctly. Just a good habit to get into. Let's take a look at Shutdown now. A lot of problems with Shutdown now. So a lot of people weren't implementing the specification correctly. You have to check to see whether the future is canceled and whether it's done. And if neither of those things are true, then you go ahead and cancel it. Likewise, a similar problem here. This one's using a stream, but you don't want to, you need to make sure you do the right checks. Another recommendation, by the way, is if you're going to use a stream, is to use filter as opposed to peak, and then you can do some clever things with filter, which is really cool. And you don't actually have to have count here, so I recommend you use for each instead. There's no sense in having count. It doesn't really help you very much. Another problem here is that this does not meet the specification at all. It's neither checking to see whether it's canceled, nor it's checking to see whether it's done. It's just canceling it unilaterally, which is not the specification. I was not sure what the heck was going on here, but whatever it is, it's definitely incorrect, and it does not fulfill the specification above. Using a bitwise OR operation is very strange. Down here, there's no need to have the Boolean check, so no need to have the Boolean check. Just put this expression into the if statement instead. So go ahead and do that. That'll work just fine. Never, 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 ever use an index-based for loop when you can use a for each loop or the for each method, both of which work perfectly fine here. And once again, this implementation does not meet the specification in the comments above. So those are my comments on assignment 2A. Please make sure you address those and then integrate that into your solution for assignment 2B, which will be coming out shortly.